My name is Kassandra Luciuk. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. I'm also the author of a new book on internment called Enemy Alien, A True Story of Life Behind Barbed Wire, which is now out through Between the Lines Press. Enemy Alien is a true story based on the memoir of an internee who was held at Kapuskasing. The book begins in 1914 when he's arrested, and it details his 3 years in the camp, everything from forced labor to disciplinary regimes, and of course, moments of resistance. By 1917, the government was granting internees parole in order to fill wartime labor shortages in industries such as railway construction, mining, and agriculture. And the protagonist of the book was one of these internees. He was released into the custody of the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation, or DOSCO, in Nova Scotia. And he worked for DOSCO as essentially a slave laborer until 1923. We have to remember that when armistice was declared in November 1918, most internees were not simply free to go. Those who had been paroled were forced to continue working against their will, sometimes for several years. In the case of the protagonist of Enemy Alien, the only reason he was freed was because he had been blacklisted by DOSCO for starting a union. Others who remained in the camps were sometimes incarcerated as late as 1920, when they were finally let go or forcibly deported. Enemy Alien then ends with the author's return to Kapuskasing in 1945. Internment as a historical subject has been really difficult to research because the majority of documents were destroyed by the government. And as a result, researchers have long relied on fragmentary evidence and clever finds in adjacent archives to try to tell this story. Moreover, because internment was such a secret for so long, it was too late in most cases to rely on oral history interviews or witness testimony. And that's what's so special about this story. It gives us a comprehensive insight into the internment operations through the eyes and perspective of someone who was actually interned. For a topic that has for so long been told on behalf of internees, this book really tries to recenter them, and that's really important. What also makes this book special is that it's a graphic novel. And while this might seem like an unorthodox format, graphic novels have in recent years become very popular mediums for what are very serious topics. What's great about them is that they're accessible and they're frankly really fun to read. Now, that doesn't mean that they're ahistorical or undeveloped or that they're geared towards younger audiences. Rather, they just allow you to more easily convey what are quite complex historical and social justice issues. When I first found the source that the book is based on, I had no intention of turning it into something for a popular audience. I was working on an academic article on internment, and I thought that I would take what I could from it and then that would just be it. But the longer I worked with the source, the more I realized that this was a story that not only needed to be told in its entirety, but that also needed to reach beyond academic circles. And at the same time, I was being introduced to the world of graphic novels. And it was this kind of light bulb moment for me when I realized that this would be the perfect fit. It would allow me to gear the content towards a popular audience. It was accessible, it was different, and perhaps most importantly, it let me tell the story in a creative way without undermining the gravity of the subject. At the end of the day, I just wanted the book in the hands of people who, for a variety of very valid reasons, can't spend endless time on this, but who want to know about what happened here. And I think a graphic novel accomplishes that. Writing this book has taught me a lot about internment. First and foremost, I learned just how connected internment was to other processes occurring in Canada at the same time. A really great example of this is the connection between Kapuskasing internment camp and efforts by the Canadian government to expand colonial settlement in the early 20th century. So the location of Kapuskasing wasn't an accident. It sat at this very critical juncture for nation building because it could connect Winnipeg to the west, with existing settlements in southern and eastern Ontario. So once Indigenous communities were forcibly dispossessed from the land, the government wanted to figure out a way to bring settlers into the region. And of course, this was a very difficult task because no settlers wanted to move there, right? At the time, most of Kapuskasing was heavy forest, and no one was entirely clear what crops might grow. So the government took advantage of this captive population of internees to do the work to bring it up to so-called colonial standards of settlement. Internees not only worked an experimental farm where they tested crops to see what could grow in this so-called clay belt, but they also built the railway and roads. They provided essential services like firefighting for the earliest settlements and so on. And we can see examples of this in other camps. Internees held near Banff, for example, did much of the same work. Plus, they were also forced to work on private projects like the golf course that's there. So the book made clear to me that the significance of internment is so much bigger in that it really did serve as a vanguard for colonialism and settlement that wouldn't have otherwise been economically feasible. The second thing is just how widespread resistance to internment was, and the sheer lengths that internees were willing to go to in an attempt to free themselves. And this happened on multiple levels. I learned from my research that there was an escape tunnel dug by internees that connected the second class yard to the first class yard and then to the quartermaster's store where the arms and ammunition for the camp were kept. Now, the internees were caught before they could finish the tunnel, but you can use your imagination about what might have happened had they succeeded. The internees also engaged in almost never-ending protest regarding everything from unsafe work to not enough time off on religious holidays. Sometimes this manifested as work slowdowns, where internees would purposely move slowly, damage their tools, or otherwise sabotage their ability to work. But in the majority of cases, they went on strike or they would riot. And this was often at great personal cost to them. Guards would almost immediately put them on a bread and water diet and lock them up in a shack that was located on an island in the middle of the river. And they were held here in isolation until they renounced their cause. Yet no matter how many times the guards tried to discipline them, the spirit of the internees didn't break. And I think that this not only speaks to the intense feelings of desperation in that internees were willing to do anything to try to free themselves, but also to this sense of community that developed amongst them, which fueled them in even the most trying of times. There were psychological components to this as well. In Kapuskasing, as in other camps, there were internees who were politically active before their incarceration. Most were members of the Ukrainian Social Democratic Party, and who, as a result of that, were quite gifted orators. And these internees were not only at the forefront of organizing resistance, but also helped others intellectualize their experiences so that they didn't think of them as anecdotal expressions of xenophobia, for example, but rather as a symptom of a larger political and economic system that used immigrants to build the nation without ever letting them fully join it as equal citizens. Relatedly, this project taught me a lot about how internees themselves conceptualized their incarceration and how this impacted how they saw the world around them and how the organized Ukrainian community responded as a result. Again, the majority of government documents on internment were destroyed, so we still don't entirely understand the impact of this event on the people who actually lived it. There's a famous line by a Ukrainian RCMP informant from 1940 that Ukrainians still lived in fear of the barbed wire fence. And this is as close as we've ever come to understanding the internee psyche. In fact, the memoir on which the book is based was left anonymous, which illustrates this fear quite well. Even writing in 1945, the author did not feel safe using his real name. But this project has offered further clues about how internees felt about this. I mentioned earlier that the book ends with the protagonist returning to Kapuskasing, and in this closing section of the book, he asks some rather profound questions that hint at his ideas and framing of this. So he talks about how when he arrived in Canada in 1912, He was immediately put in an immigration shed where he was held until he could pay a $25 fee. Of course, very few people, including the protagonist, could afford to pay this. So the government then sent representatives from private companies who agreed to pay the fee in exchange for cheap labor. So one of the highest rates of pay I've been able to find was 9 cents an hour compared to a white Anglo laborer's average wage of between 25 and 35 cents an hour. If you didn't accept the job, you were deported. And this was the fate of a lot of Ukrainians who filed into Canada's industrial centers in the early 20th century. Those who received parcels of land in Western Canada fared little better. Not only was their work arduous, but then in 1930, when the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl hit, many couldn't afford to keep up, so trust companies claimed the land as their own, and tens of thousands of Ukrainians ended up destitute, joining the Ukrainians already in these industrial centers. Because of this, Ukrainians would often travel across the country looking for work. The protagonist specifically talks about going to Sudbury to try to get a job with the International Nickel Company, or INCO, because they were promising their workers $6 for an 8-hour day. This turned out to be a little bit of a scam because INCO used the high interest in the work as a way to drive down wages. High unemployment makes it really difficult to advocate for a better wage because you're seen as expendable. There's always somebody there to replace you. All of this is to say that for internees, the act of internment, while abhorrent, was not an isolated incident in their lives. Whether they were behind barbed wire or not, their lives in Canada were exceptionally difficult. Yes, internment was significant because for many, it served as a turning point when they realized that the promises of liberal democracy didn't apply to them. But as they continued on, they came to understand internment not as an outlier, but rather as emblematic of this unjust system. This was a human being sold a bill of goods about life in Canada, who gets here only to be locked in an immigration shed and sold to a private company as a source of cheap labor. Then the war breaks out and he's exposed to rising levels of xenophobia. And whether it was because he couldn't find work or he simply looked suspicious, he's sent to an internment camp where he spends his time clearing roads, building railways, and so on. He was literally building the foundations of a country who saw him as an undesirable and as an alien. Then he's sold again to a private company and held against his will, only getting out because he's blacklisted for daring to try to make his life better. This is why this story still needs to be told. We need to be crystal clear that this was part and parcel of Canada's long-standing and unjust treatment towards populations it deemed as undesirable others. And instead of retreating into a form of ethnic particularism, we need to branch out and connect internment to other injustices. I would argue that the legacies and lessons of internment didn't end with an apology from the government. When you apologize for something, the assumption is not only that you understand what you did wrong, but also that you won't repeat it again. And we don't have to look too far for examples of this happening again, historically or contemporarily. I think that's a difficult pill to swallow. Most people don't like looking at difficult aspects of their country's history, especially if it might challenge or unsettle their preconceived notions. And we see this play out time and time again. For example, in public reactions to Indigenous issues, there's a blessed ignorance at play here. But I was very heartened to see the recent response from SUSC regarding Black Lives Matter and the ongoing civil rights violations of Black Americans and Canadians. SUSC used internment as an example of why our community needs to be vocal on this issue. As a community, we have to keep making connections like this. We can't only care about injustices perpetuated against us. We will never truly understand the significance of internment unless we hold accountable the system that allowed it to happen, which is now being used against others. Since I just mentioned SUSC, I want to talk a bit about why it's important for the next generation to take up the cause of internment. I teach at a university, and I'm still surprised at how few people know about this. When you actively participate in the Ukrainian community, you get a false sense that internment is widely acknowledged because as a community, we talk about it so much. But I remember when I first started teaching, and I was always very timid about bringing it up when I taught the First World War. And this was partially out of an admittedly silly desire not to overdo it, because I was convinced that everyone already knew about this and didn't need to hear me go on about it. And I now realize that that's really not the case. And so I've made sure to incorporate it into my lectures. And of course, I've rethought my aversion to researching and writing about internment, hence the publication of Enemy Alien. So this is something that the next generation needs to take up because it's still not well known. Secondly, historical narratives and our understanding of the past always benefit from the intervention of subsequent generations. Part of this is simply practical. The more hands you have on deck, the better. The more people that study and promote internment, the more nuance we can add, and the more discoveries we can make. Part of this is also that each generation has its own set of priorities and interests, and that can often lead to amazing discoveries. For example, there's an archaeologist, Sarah Beaulieu, who is using ground-penetrating radar to locate and examine historical artifacts and the material culture of internment camps. And I can't say enough good things about Sarah's work because it's such an imaginative approach. Now, the first generation of scholars and activists did a really good job, first of all, proving that this happened, doing the detective work in the archives, and piecing together a comprehensive narrative. And several of the earlier videos in the series illuminate that challenging and groundbreaking work. But Sarah's project, I would argue, shows us what can happen when a new generation tries our hand. It's been a similar experience for me in the sense that my own exposure to and perspective on internment has allowed me to look for sources in places that others before me maybe hadn't thought of. Enemy Alien and my next project on internment, which is on a camp guard at Fort Henry in Kapuskasing, are both based on materials from archives that others hadn't been in yet. And that's not to brag or to disparage anyone. I say this to encourage a new generation to once again try their hand. Just because we have a solid basis already built doesn't mean that there isn't more to learn and discover. The possibilities on this front, I think, are truly endless.